Sellars Conference, Day 3, Talk 1, John McDowell.
The return of manual. The return of the manual. The return of the manual. That's nicer water. I would have liked to hear more about it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't feel like it. I see it obscure. Yeah. I mean, the letter is very so, I was reading the paper and I think, okay, I'm going to get this read before the talk starts. How you doing?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you. Nice.
Naturally, nice. Yeah, do you know what the sandwiches I get bought in
How's it going?
I think it's 10 o'clock. I think we'll start. Everyone sit Okay, I think we're ready to start. Hello, everybody. I think we're ready. We're ready to start. In keeping with our conventions, I will introduce our speaker by not introducing him. My role is simply the Ed McMahon role on the Tonight Show. Here's Johnny.
I'm going to say hardly anything to begin, except to say it's all Jim's fault. I blame it all on Jim. I mean, as you can tell, what this paper is a contribution to a possibly notional, mythical, posthumous fist trip for John Hoagland. When Jim and Johannes invited me to this, I asked Jim what I should put in, and he said, how about the stuff about the B deduction that you prepared for a conference here in honor of John Hoagland, actually just before he died. And the trouble was that what I had got ready to say about the B deduction then was kind of written up, and it was in this frame. But I take it that the thought was the stuff about the B deduction is what it would be appropriate for this group to talk about. And now, the second level of It's Jim's Fault, there's a footnote in this version of it, and the point of talking about it at this conference in honor of John Hoagland was to recall happy times in the lives of the three of us when we read the aesthetic and the analytic, not the dialectic, of the first critique together, and kept coming back to the B deduction. What it says in the footnote is this is a reading that the three of us worked out, but the fact is that what this started from was what Jim put forward as a recollection of a paper he had written as a graduate student, I assume, for Dieter Henry. Yeah. Jim didn't even, as far as I could see, try to find this paper and produce the actual object, but told us what it contained, and it contained the germ of this story about the B-deduction. And we worked it out, details, together, but I think of it really as Jim's reading of the B-deduction. And now, I've been trying over the years since, this is now some time back, late 90s, trying to formulate this account of what's going on in the B-deduction, one way or another. From time to time, Jim says, no, this bit's not right, which is exactly the kind of thing that used to happen in these three-way conversations with one or other of us would kind of lose it and need to be brought back in track by the others. So far, he hasn't made a move with that shape in respect of this version of the saying, my attempt to say how Conant taught me to read the B-deduction. So where that goes is direct questions just as much to Jim as to me.
Fingers or hands? I think hand. You can have a finger.
The finger first.
Sorry, I should start.
Yes, please.
I'm sorry. Okay. I mean, this is a point in the reading of the deduction that I wanted to ask about. I mean, or it's not. It's a point that goes beyond it to an anticipation of a possible Hegelian response. The bottom of page 11. Things change if we stop supposing that the formal character of the power of thought can be understood in abstraction from something that plays the role of sensibility, something other than the power of thought taken to be needed for the actual positive of the power of thought to have a subject matter. If we stop supposing that, then we say unfolding the forms of thought is unfolding the forms of reality. I guess the question is, how easy is it to stop supposing that? I thought I could bring this up by tying in with something that came up in the discussion of Thomas's paper. Right. It was important to Thomas's paper, as I understood it, that there be such a thing as the form of our sensibility, which is thought of as a kind of manifoldness can be considered in abstraction, at least, from its being brought to whatever kind of unity the understanding brings it to in constituting a formal intuition from it. Yeah. Jim, in describing Thomas's position, accurately characterized this aspect of Thomas's position, and studiously did not take a view about it. But it sounded to me like there was hidden in the background kind of eyebrow arching or something like that.
Learn to control it.
But it seems to me like, I mean, Thomas's position is a direct consequence of very fundamental commitments to Kant's outlook. I think that if our power of cognition is finite, that is to say that our understanding can't intuit, right? And that one aspect of that limitation of our power of understanding is that if there is to be a form proper to the faculty by which we receive intuition, then that can't be anticipated by the a priori cognition sheerly of the understanding. Right, it's really the formal application of the recognition of the finitude of our power of cognition. And so it sounds to me like you're saying, well, if we just suppose that, whatever. I know this is Hegel, I guess, but I mean, but just to bring out, it's that it's no simple step to make, right? It doesn't amount to saying if we suppose that our power of cognition is not finite, and how do I go about thinking that?
If we just suppose, is the way you gave me back what I said, and there isn't any just in there.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not pretending that that would be a simple move. I'm inclined to say yes, you're right. I mean, I take it that it is a way of getting at something in Hegel's reaction to Kant, to say Hegel thinks that our power of cognition is finite is, I mean, as that thought is manipulated in Kant anyway, is wrong, right? And of course, that's not an easy thing to wrap one's mind around. I'm kind of not ready to I mean, that's a throwaway section at the end of a story about the B deduction, pointing to, I suppose, a program for making sense of the general shape of Hegel's logic as something that you might arrive at starting from an understanding of what goes on in Kant's treatment of the categories.
Yeah.
But I'm perfectly happy to say, and there's absolutely no just about it, right? I mean, this is a way to get from Kant to Hegel. Stop supposing that, and if you like, put it that way, stop supposing that our power of cognition is finite. Anyway, if what that's supposed to mean is what it for sure does mean for Kant. Mm-hmm. How the hell can we do that? I think for present purposes, it's okay for me to say yes. Good question.
Okay.
Sorry, I mean that's kind of
no, all right.
Yeah.
I mean that's. I guess. I mean, I was partly there's a sentence on the next page. Hegel does not think it needs arguing that the idea of the forms of reality and the idea of the forms of thought are just two guys is a single idea.
That's meant to be a descendant of the thing that I want to say about Kant in opposition to John Hoagland. Kant doesn't think it needs arguing that. The only form that empirical reality could conceivably have is a form that, as Kant sees things, has its is given by requirements that have their source in the understanding. Mm-hmm. That is not a substantive thesis for Kant. Mm-hmm. And then that was meant to be a kind of descendant, non-substantive thing for Hegel.
Well, okay. I mean, I guess I just wanted to bring out that space has 3 dimensions. I mean, maybe we don't believe that anymore, but anyway, Kant believed it. That time has only one. I think we do still believe that. These are features of the character of the manifoldness of our form of sensibility that the understanding couldn't anticipate, sheerly out of its own general idea of an object of cognition given sensibly. Right there, there seem to be strong systematic reasons for thinking that a view like that is right. If we, and I just,
good.
So I was wondering if you could give more help with transcending it.
I mean, unless somebody can help out with this, I mean, I'm not ready to take on the perfectly reasonable thing you're saying, which in this context amounts to, look, Kant's got it perfectly straight. That's all right. Take on board what Kant does in the critical philosophy. There's nothing wrong with the conception of our power of cognition being finite as manipulated by Kant. So you're asking not just how, but why. How can we make this transition? And anyway, why should we?
Yeah. Not on the table here. Okay. All right.
I was going to ask if I could say two things, but
Well,
the
I think
person
that
can
would be
ask
an appropriate.
is
Yes.
me.
Yeah.
I just wanted to say two things. They're a very, very long story, of course, what John is saying, but the interesting things are this, that Hegel agrees with Kant's criticism of Leibniz's identity of indiscernibles principle. That's not right. The idea that the range of the conceptual can determine something about the real doesn't mean it can determine everything about the real. So that's a sort of concession to obvious common sense. Hegel doesn't deny contingency. And conceptual likeness, in the Leibniz case, doesn't serve to individuate. You need numerical identity. So he agrees with the Kantian criticism, which is, first of all, surprising. And the second thing is his account of spatiality and temporality is in the philosophy of nature. So it has something to do with the characteristics of the world we live in, rather than with the pure forms of intuition. That's the beginning of the story, those 2 points. And Jim had a follow-up point.
Yeah, well, there's a lot here, but let me just throw some things out for discussion. There's a question of what John was marking as in sort of a possible Hegel's target range, the way Kant sets up the deduction. Then there was an issue Thomas raised that looked like a slightly different reading of Kant from the one we're getting just now from John, and a possible eyebrow going up. And there was a suggestion those were the same issue. And then there's an issue of if there is a criticism of Kant from Hegel's point of view, how could it possibly not, move us past what we want to think? So just maybe a word about each of those issues. I mean, one thing worried me a bit the way you said it is you made the first two look like the same thing. In a way, it wasn't how I see it. I think the Thomas variant of how to read Kant on this issue and the McDowell variant of how to read Kant on this issue would put them equally in Hegel's target range, rightly or wrongly. But they're different. And the nicety doesn't seem nothing to me. The question is, something like this is right. The way you put it sounds to me just fine, which is, certain features about the determinate character of our form of sensibility. We can start going into it in some detail, maybe saying space is 3 dimensions, or we cannot construct a two-sided closed plane figure, or whatever, in our intuition. Where there's nothing about the character of the form of the understanding itself that can anticipate, or as you put it, I think, those features of ours. That's right. That seems right. That's Kant's view. And textually, that's Kant's view. But that's neutral with respect to an issue, I think, that is both sides can agree to that and have a disagreement about how to understand an issue about form of sensibility. Here's one view of form of sensibility. The sensibility is a self-standing capacity. It has its own form. Then it comes into play with the understanding, and then it gives rise to some more complicated form of cognitive faculty in which it's ingredient. So we can completely abstract from the understanding and have something in view, which is form of sensibility. That's one view. And then the formal intuition form of sensibility thing might look like a way of marking that. Though interestingly, our formal intuition is up space. The thing that we were saying some things about to bring up. Another view is that the possibility of unity in a sensible manifold is already a mark of the activity of the understanding. So that which we cannot anticipate and determine a character or form of sensibility is going to stand. The form of sensibility is going to stand to the form of the understanding there in a relation of comparatively determinable to comparatively determinate. But whatever form sensibility has will, be in accord with the form of the understanding. So the thing that first comes into the aesthetic as form of sensibility, if we tried to understand it in complete abstraction from the understanding, would not even give us the determinate character. And in that sense, there could be a worry about whether we can have something that involves a strict abstraction described as getting sensibility as such into view, and then splitting two notions of form, such that one, the formal intuition is just on the understanding side, the form intuition is just on sensibility. There can be a reason for saying this synthesis should be attributed to sensibility because of the way in which the kind of unity, that's involved in things being in space is different than bringing things under a concept. So there's a reason to attribute to sensibility, even though it presupposes a synthesis, that belongs to the understanding. So that seems to be what that disagreement's about. That's a disagreement about exactly how to understand the details of the dependence of these two faculties. Both those views, it seems to me, are consistent with Kant being committed to something which he wants to call the forms of sensibility, which are parochially ours, that at some level of characterization of our power of sensibility, it will have a character which, as he put it, the understanding can anticipate. As long as he thinks that, I think he's going to be in Hegel's target range. But that disagreement doesn't seem to me, it seems to me to be orthogonal to the issue about whether he's criticizing Hegel. Then maybe just about the other issue, I'll just say two sentences about that. It seems to me, at the very least, part of, I think, what strikes Hegel, but others people can speak to this who know more, is that what is kind of striking, I think, if one thinks about the idea of form of sensibility in Kant, is that it kind of works at various levels. The one at which he's most interested in when he first introduces it is the aesthetic, is something such that the idea of there being another, does not involve a contradiction. And so that's the sense in which we can speak of our forms of sensibility. In a way, we can't speak of our forms of understanding. There is at least a kind of minimal conceptual parochialism with respect to it that's thinkable. But some of the arguments, it seems to me, like the argument, that all parts of space are parts of one space, some of the transcendental expositions for each of the forms of sensibility look to me like an argument that any finite sensible being is going to have to be able to run, regardless of what the order. That is, they seem to involve constraints on being able to make sense of or having a faculty of sensibility. That is, they seem to involve a level of reflection that is the complement of the reflection of forms of sensibility, forms of understanding in relation to a manifold at all. These seem to be features that any manifold, is going to have to, qua the manifold of the sensing being. One could say, let's put it this way: from the first person plural perspective, other finite cognizers in Kant's sense, be they possible, look like they ought to be able to run a version of these arguments. Now, the stuff about being able to construct a two-sided plainclothes figure looks like it involves a different level of determinacy in the and so it looks like the notion of form of sensibility, one could distinguish between the generic notion you need to just have the complement of the concept of form of understanding such that you want to know what must be true of a sensible manifold such that its form could be in concert with the forms of the understanding. And there's something else which is part of a project to vindicate our entitlement to Euclidean geometry and other things, which is also going on in aesthetic. So, it's a question about how those things are related, at least. And at the very least, it seems like a Hegelian could have this worry. These topics should be separated. And if what space is about is the conditions of outer intuition, or if what space is about this part of mathematics, these are projects for different parts of a systematic philosophy. And the first question is a much more fundamental one with respect to something like a transcendental inquiry, and it should not be run together with the other one. It seems like that would be the beginning already of a Hegelian ambition to rewrite the way in which certain enterprises prosecute. So certain things that about intuition that Hegel cares about, coming up in what Robert said, would happen, from the beginning. But other details of what Kant has to say about space and mathematics and physics could come very late. And this would look like just decidophobia about what one thinks about intuition.
I have 3 fingers, so I think I'm going to close off the fingers. Next, if you want to announce yourself, you have to be a hand. So I have John, Steve, and Matt.
This was a finger to what Jim just said, almost all of which I embrace. But there was something. There was a sort of framework to it that I didn't get. Which isn't that I didn't dispute it, but I didn't get it. Going back to, Matt did this going back to your discussion with Thomas, and there was a presupposition that something that I was saying about what Kant does was somehow out of line with what Thomas was saying about the form of sensibility as such. I think that was the locution. And I just don't understand that. I mean, what I say about Kant's disarming of the threat that he disarms, according to you and me in the second half of the B deduction, is at a level way up above the text. I don't talk about the footnote at B160, where Kant draws the distinction between the form of intuition and the formal intuition. That I thought was the topic of the to and fro between you and Thomas. What Thomas said about how to understand that distinction struck me as actually perfectly congenial to what that is we, you and I, wanted, have wanted, and still want, and I want. Right? To say about how Kant disarms that threat. The threat is, it seems that an understanding of something that we can kind of vaguely put in place as the form of sensibility. An idea that's at our disposal if we read only the aesthetic and don't bother about its position. There's a threat that conformity to that all by itself would make sense of an idea of maybe not objects but realities being present to the senses. If that were allowed, it would wreck the whole project, so it mustn't be allowed. It isn't allowed because what Kant urges, and I do this in the most generic way in the second half of the deduction, is that this idea that's so far in place only vaguely as the idea of the form of sensibility is actually not an idea that's intelligible in dependence of the unifying power of the spontaneous intellect. That's an idea that one can put in place in terms of, now back to the distinction that's in the footnote that Thomas, I think, very helpfully talks about, in terms of the formal intuition. The formal intuition is an intuition. It comes under the scope of what's said about intuitions in the first half. That is, it has that kind of unity. So, and then what I thought was really helpful about Thomas's account of the form of intuition, to be distinguished maybe from the formal intuition, is that there's nothing to that except the idea of a potentiality for. And then the first thing that we focus on, thinking of what's an act of this potentiality, is the formal intuition. And I take it that the thought there is that this works backwards now. The very idea of the form of sensibility cashed out now as what's to be meant by the form of intuition as opposed to the formal intuition doesn't make any difference which of those you pick on, because the form labeled the form of intuition is nothing except the potential for the form had by the formal intuition, and the form had by the formal intuition is unintelligible outside the context of the unifying power of the spontaneous intellect. So Kant's home free, and I was actually thinking of Thomas's reading of that distinction as something like grist to my mill. If somebody said, "Come on," there still is in Kant, even after the second half of the B deduction, this idea of the form of intuition. It's all very well for you to go on and on about, in effect, the formal intuition. Still, wouldn't the form of intuition be enough to make sense of presence of objects to the senses? to which one might say, well, yes, it would, but look, that doesn't give us a viable concept of realities being present to the senses that can be detached from. So that's just about a presupposition of the way you were talking. You were talking as if the eyebrow that you were not raising but suggesting could be raised by what Thomas did might be raised by me.
We should probably let Thomas talk about my eyebrow.
Well, yeah.
But my eyebrow is still twitching, I confess. I mean, first of all, as I said, this is a very nice point in that I agree that, I mean, the basic shape of Thomas's reading seems to me not only congenial to the overall shape of the reading of the deduction, but very helpful for implementing. So it's very much a point of detail here. But you know, it seems to me, you know, either one says that what one's got, once one, you know, moves from the formal intuition, the formal intuition understood this way, is a notion of form, which one's attributing to sensibility, that can now come into view as something like a mere potentiality for form. So that
it's a form that's a potentiality for. Yes.
Well, I mean, but I feel like,
and then but everything hangs on whether that form is itself to be conceived as
let's put it
matter that is somehow autonomously present.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. So I mean, I guess the point is that you know, if one wants to say that we have here a form, you know, whose actualization, you know, is empty, insofar as sensibility is being considered as such in relation from the understanding. If I suppose that's the way to parse it, then I think, you know, then I think this is just a notational variant, something I'm happy to say, and it's fine. It's just that as soon as the locution makes it look like, even though we're considering sensibility as such, we've got a notion of form whose actualization is an idea which we've somehow given content to, despite the abstraction of the understanding. Then I think it's starting to look like something. Maybe I misunderstood Matt.
No, you're getting it right. Yeah.
That Matt was ascribing to Thomas, which is the idea that Kant's committed to the idea that, you know, there's a notion of form which we ascribe to sensibility, which has to be intelligible independently of the form of the understanding.
Sorry, that's I think. Well, whatever. I should let things go.
Right. And I was just trying to say, I mean, this reading is, as I understand this reading, committed to denying that while agreeing with the main point Matt was making, that the you know, the determinacy of this form and something that's parochially our form of sensibility is going to outrun, you know, what the understanding can anticipate, and that's enough to put it in Hegel's target range. So you can have something that really resists a certain kind of, I think, fairly orthodox reading of Kant as understanding these powers as being independently and self-standingly intelligible, that the understanding of either power requires understanding how they're aspects of a single cognitive power, while still putting in Hegel's target range. And I think that's what we're saying, because a lot of people read the Kant-Hegel relationship as if Hegel simply insisting on that point of unity is the thing that he was complaining about in Kant. So you make Kant stupider than he is, and I think what's really interesting about Hegel gets lost by just ascribing to Hegel a point that seems to me is, you know, already in the B160 and footnote. Or one reads the B160 and footnote and goes, holy mackerel, Kant's become really Hegelian at this point. But he couldn't possibly have meant it, you know, or something like that.
Steve Engstrom had a follow-up.
I had a question for John, but maybe it has to be a question for Jim too. I'll leave you all to decide. But it was a question about, I guess, the formulation. John, the sentence John wrote that Matt was asking about. John, you speak of speak of stopping supposing that the formal character of the power of thought can be understood in abstraction from something that plays the role of sensibility in thought. And I wanted to ask about that something that plays the role of sensibility. That's a sufficiently general characterization as to not distinguish between what Kant says he's not abstracting from in section 21 and what he says he is abstracting from. And this is a point that I know is not lost on you, so I wanted to just ask whether you then were meaning to speak there indirectly of the form, which Kant does say he's abstracting from, or at least the mode, the way in which the manifold is given. That's something he says he must abstract from in order to direct attention solely to the unity that's contributed by the understanding. So it looks as though there he's making that's the point where he acknowledges or points out the benefit of the reader now that he's finished doing it. He has been abstracting from the form of sensibility all along, or the mode anyway. So is that specifically what you mean to include, or is did you? I mean, when you spoke of our, stopping from supposing that we can conceive of the understanding, this form of understanding in abstraction from sensibility, the role of sensibility, that was meant to include the form as well.
Well, the trouble is there are too many forms for the form as well. Let me say what I think I meant, and then Jim can tell me what I really meant if it isn't what I say. It's meant to be the thing that in 21 Kant says he can't abstract from. Right. So he's, if I'm understanding, what he can abstract from is the specifically human. But he can't abstract from some sensibility or other. So there's a conception of sensibility abstract enough to allow for the thought. We can't know that there aren't finite knowers whose sensibility is formed otherwise than ours. Formed as ours is, that is abstracted from. But now, formed in some way in which anything that is recognizable as a sensibility has to be formed. He can't abstract from that. And I don't know, I mean, this is really crude, but a way to kind of wave in the direction of the change. Kant is almost there in making the moves he makes. I don't know, maybe I shouldn't go on. This is just going to be so lame, but let me go on one step. It's kind of as if Hegel took Kant by the lapels and said, look, Kant, in making the move you make about the thing that you can't abstract from, the form of sensibility as such doesn't have to be specifically ours. You might as well be acknowledging that the necessity for something about which you can say that is part of the total truth about the power of thought. It shouldn't be conceived as something other than the power of thought, which equips the power of thought with subject matter. That's the power of thought. And that's a way in which the power of thought is in act. And is that too simple?
I like that part.
But you didn't like the...
No, I mean, it's just a complication of, like, as you said, the trickiness about talking about forms and how it counts to me. I mean, the way I understand what's happening there, I'll put it as baldly as I can, so it can provoke this, so yes, I mean, in the first half of the deduction, we're considering some of the categories, as I think he puts at one point, with a manifold of intuition lying before them. So we're not abstracting from sensibility.
Yeah.
The categories require some matter to synthesize, or we can't make the transition from pure general logic to transcendental logic. We need a relation to sensibility. But we say we're doing something which is abstracting from our forms of intuition, or the form of necessary intuition. And the question is, what does that mean?
Right.
So we have an abstract.
Maybe to kind of just get past this point.
Yeah.
I think it's clear that Kant recognizes some kind of distinction between a form of sensibility in general and our forms of sensibility.
Yeah. Oh, I agree.
His talk, and he
I agree.
organizes the deduction, I think, in a way that reflects that.
Yeah.
So let's just keep the attention focused on our form.
Right.
Specifically our form.
Right, good. Yeah, no, I agree. I think what's nice about the deduction is some distinction like that becomes very clear there. One wonders
Exactly.
what the transcendental aesthetic would have looked like if it was rewritten, with those two notions kept separate.
If he'd written a longer book, he opted not to do, he
Yeah.
might have gone
Yeah.
into these matters.
Because it seems to me some of the transcendental
He thought it was
expositions,
already too long.
some of the arguments, pertain to one, and some of the arguments pertain to the other, but they're all just
Right, they're
about
not all
space.
separated out, that's right.
But so then I'm thinking with respect to this idea that we abstract from our forms of intuition, there's one reason. I mean, I think this is just a version of what John's saying, put a different way. One reason not to write things this way, so we then lift that abstraction, is that there's two ways you might have understood the abstraction had been in place. One way is, okay, there's this self-standing, perfectly intelligible idea of the formedness of our sensibility with its determinate character. The formal conditions of sensibility, whatever they are, and those are independent of the formal conditions of understanding. And we've just abstracted from those formal conditions, and we've just considered the understanding in relation to that matter. And so what we're doing when we lift the abstraction is interpreting a completely independent layer of form. Or, and this is what I think he's trying to show in the second half of the deduction, that the unity of our mode of intuition cannot be simply other than the unity which the categories prescribe. That is to say that the unity, that which we've abstracted from, must itself, exhibit accord with the unity we've been working with throughout the first half of the deduction. So, however we understand this idea that, more determinately characterized, our form of sensibility involves forms of togetherness that the understanding could anticipate. It can't be the kind of anticipate which has to do with an idea of two heterogeneous forms. How do they hook up? I think that's sort of the issue that's put in section 13 in the passage. I think John calls the rogue appearances passage or something like that, with the idea that, sensibility could be so constituted that, as it happens, it simply could not yield to a rule of synthesis. It's connected, I think, to the other passage you and I were discussing in the middle of yesterday. And that idea, I think, as John puts it, I think is one we're supposed to think through in understanding the second half of the deduction as something that shows itself as merely the appearance of a possibility, rather than being...
Matt, you're on the finger cue.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to respond briefly to Jim's representation of the situation. So one thing Jim said was that, there's the general disagreement that Hegel has with Kant, which could be expressed in the proposition, is there a form of sensibility that the understanding can't anticipate? And then there are the dispute between Thomas as I represented him and Jim and John as Jim represented him is a dispute subsidiary to that basic division. Just to say what I had in mind, I mean, I think that there is a strong systematic reason in Kant for the claim that sensibility has formal features that the understanding can't anticipate. It grows out of this basic thought that our understanding can't intuit, and therefore that the power and virtue of which we have intuition, insofar as it has a form, can't be anticipated sheerly on the basis of the pure cognition of the understanding itself. And I take Kant to have thought that the one-dimensionality of space and the three-dimensionality of the three-dimensionality of space and one-dimensionality of time illustrate that point. But the systematic point can be separated from the illustrations, right? The systematic point seems to me to be strong, difficult to give up. The form of manifoldness that is involved in the givenness of objects on Kantian principle should not be something that the understanding can of itself anticipate. I don't see a tension between that fact and the fact that a number of the arguments of the aesthetic depend on features of the unity of the form of sensibility that involve a contribution of the understanding. And that's, in a way, what Kant brings to our attention in the footnote, as I understand it. But it's not that, I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm in disagreement with everybody else here, but it doesn't seem to me that that induces the idea of two forms of sensibility. There is
two levels
one
of abstraction.
well, okay, right.
Right.
There's two levels of abstraction. Yeah.
It's all two forms.
Okay. Well, let me respond to one more thing. There was a thought that if you say anything but that the form of sensibility as such, to use Thomas's phrase, is a mere potentiality for comprehension by the understanding, then you're going too far. I agree with the thought that you could think of the form of sensibility as such as matter to the form of the understanding, and as in general with matter, it's to be thought of as merely potential to form. But that's not to say that there's nothing in its own right that characterizes it. Whatever demands of unity that the understanding imposes don't entail the specific character of the matter on which they're imposed. We know a priori in virtue of the fact that we have the power of sensibility that we have. Anyway, that's my understanding of the situation. So I think it differs somewhat from your.
Well, I think I agree with what you just said. Maybe everything you said, but that was put sufficiently carefully that it's neutral with respect to, shall we say, how heterogeneous that the formedness of that matter considered as the form of the matter until the understanding could be from the form of the understanding. I mean that. So.
I just mean that there is such a thing as forming this abstraction, and it will lead us to make such claims as the one-dimensionality of space is not
three.
Sorry, the one-dimensionality of time. I give up. The one-dimensionality of time is something that the understanding couldn't anticipate, right? I mean that's interesting substantive thought about the a priori knowledge that we have of time. It is not on Kantian principles logical a priori knowledge. It's not grounded in the understanding.
Yeah, go. They're really crude. In this section that I'm palpably uncomfortable with, I've stopped talking about the understanding and started talking about the power of thought.
Yeah.
So a really simple-minded way to... right, I mean, my image of Hegel taking Kant by the lapels.
Mm-hmm.
look, Kant, you're lining up the very idea of the power of thought with the understanding as you're conceiving it, and sure, that couldn't anticipate, etc. But this is a bad conception of the power of thought. So, yeah, right.
So it will have to have temporal form. Absolutely right.
May I just reassert my thing? Because the question I really wanted to ask John is what he thinks about that question from Hegel. I mean, that paragraph is in there for some reason, right? There must be something that John thinks about Kant's transcendental deduction that makes it sensible to entertain this.
Yeah.
And so, could you just say a bit more about that?
The more that I have to say about why that paragraph is there, I think doesn't address the question that you mean to be raising. So, sorry, I'd work backwards. It's not a substantive thesis that the forms of thought and the forms of reality are two labels for those are two labels for one thing. That I took myself to have learned years ago from Sebastian Rödel, and it sort of bothered me at first, and then I thought I saw what he meant. For Hegel, that's the truth. It's something that we have to bear in mind while trying to understand, as Robert is going to help us do, what goes on in Hegel's logic. And the reason I put that paragraph in was just that, and this is obviously outrageous, given what's broken out about it. Now here we have a really clear-cut thing that might look to someone like a thesis, substantive thesis, but it isn't a substantive thesis. The thing that John Hoagland takes to have been a substantive thesis on Kant's part can be understood as a kind of ancestor of this thing that isn't a substantive thesis in Hegel. So it was meant just to kind of make vivid the thought that there were things you could think about the relation between the discursive capacity, whatever, the power of thought, on the one hand, and I don't know what reality has to be like on the other. That someone might be forgiven for taking to be substantive theses in need of argument. Working backwards from the thing that looks like a descendant in Hegel isn't. That might help make sense of how the thing that looks to Hoagland like a substantive thesis in Kant isn't. But it wasn't meant to, in any other way, urge that we take the step to the final form of the thing that isn't meant to be substantive. Yeah, sorry.
I have a question concerning your account of the relation between the first and the second part of the deduction, and it might be that you've already answered it in this discussion, but still I'm confused, so I still ask the question. So you say that in the first part of the deduction it is shown that for every complex, in order for a complex representation to be mine, it has to exhibit synthetic unity. Mm-hmm. And since intuitions are complex representations, it is shown that for an intuition to be mine, it has to exhibit synthetic unity. Mm-hmm. So that's, I completely agree. Mm-hmm. Then you say there's something left open in the first part of the deduction. Mm-hmm. That's that there might be presence to the mind, presence to the senses that doesn't exhibit synthetic unity. Mm-hmm. So first I thought, that's strange, because at least there are two things we know from the aesthetic. The first is that every presence to the mind has either spatial and or temporal form, so it's a spatial or temporal representation. And we know from the space and time arguments that every spatial and temporal representation is a complex representation. So if we take that together with what Kant says in the first part of the deduction, mm-hmm. it turns out that every presence to the mind has to exhibit synthetic unity in order to be something for me. But then I thought that wasn't your point, because I think on page 8, you say that this presence for the mind wouldn't be, you're thinking about the presence of a mind that isn't anything to me. So then I thought, okay, the idea is that the second part of the deduction is supposed to show that every presence to the senses, even if it's nothing for me, that's not the idea.
No, it's supposed to show that there isn't any application for an idea of presence to the senses that isn't presence to me, filling a gap that the first half leaves. The first half seems to leave open a possibility of presence to the senses.
Okay.
Now, that isn't presence
Okay.
to me. And the second half is supposed to.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's okay. Yeah.
All presence to the senses is presence to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
But I mean, I agree that it might be that. I mean, because of the thing you point to about the aesthetic, there might be more to be said for the thought. The first half actually does it when you think it through. Go look and see what idea of presence to the senses the aesthetic provides for. I mean, although the conceptual apparatus is not yet in place in the aesthetic. Now that we have this conceptual apparatus, we can see that it actually amounts to presence in intuition, because there has to be what we now know to call synthetic unity in any case of it, any supposed case of it. And I don't know. I've never.
Can I put it this way?
I'm looking to you for help.
Can I generalize the point? I mean, I really like what just came out of this discussion. It seems like one could generalize the point and say, I mean, part of what's at issue in the second half of the deduction is how to understand a lot of sentences in the aesthetic. So you know, if one thinks that, I'll put this very vaguely, if one thinks that the deduction is done in the first half, but there is this room for a gap between presence to mind and presence to me, then one's going to require a weak reading of a lot of sentences in the aesthetic. One's going to have to say something like singular immediate intuitions, you know, well, there's a weaker notion of intuition. It's not the notion of intuition, and so forth. And so then what the second half of the B deduction does essentially is fix a gloss on those sentences, first half of the aesthetic, which appropriately understood will in fact not leave room for that gap. So I mean, now the contrapositive of that, I think, which was your point, is if one already reads the aesthetic in light of the understanding of the aesthetic that the B deduction's trying to put into place, then there isn't anything for the second half of the B deduction to do. But I think Kant thought the first edition of the critique was like sorely misunderstood on just this point. So the point of rewriting the deduction is, in a sense, to fix the right gloss of the aesthetic. So, and this guy, I think, can be shown for lots of sentences, the aesthetic, not just the ones you picked out. So, I mean, I think that, put that way, I think it's really the other side of the coin of John's reading. It's the 2 points fit together very well, actually.
Carl Emmerich had a point.
So this presence to the senses and Hovland's paper, work in the background, I just wondered if you could remind me, have you thought much about, I hate to say it, the ineffable. So you've got there's stuff in space and time, and someone can say, well, it's always in time, but that doesn't really help us. So if you're wondering, is everything that's present to us really present to thought? I know you could say it's present to thought in the sense I could say there's this ineffable thing that's present to me that I can't categorize or something like that. But do you worry about a deeper skeptic that might just say, look, we've read the Transcendental Aesthetic before the third critique, and Kant himself grants there's this bottom layer that's kind of non-cognitive or whatever. I don't know. I'm not saying this is a serious objection, but I just wonder if you think about it very much as something that you could say a little more about than that you've already said.
I'm not sure I'm understanding everything. It sounded as if you were willing to allow an idea of presence to thought to coexist with an idea of ineffability.
To coexist, but to be very unhelpful, because all you say is there's something I'm thinking about that's ineffable, and then the person having the presence says, but that's not enough. There's some kind of qualitative.
I'm not sure that it is unhelpful. I mean, because the first thing that I'm tempted to say is ineffability brings in ideas of the power of speech, and I think quite faithfully to Kant, not talking about the power of speech. I'm talking about the power of thought. I mean, discursivity, it's hard not to reach for the idea of discourse, I mean, as we now use that. But there's a notion of discursivity in Kant that, about which the first thing to say is not something that involves reaching for that idea of discourse. For some purposes, it can be offstage for thinking about ideas like presence for thought. It can be offstage. What, if anything, the subject of this presence has it in her power to say? Maybe that would be a thing to think about, but it's not obvious that it's a thing that needs to be thought about in the context of trying to make sense of trying to make sense of what goes on in this passage in Kant, using the apparent idea of presence to the senses not involving presence for thought, and an idea of presence for thought, and thinking of Kant as aiming to say that's only an apparent idea. All presence is presence for thought. Maybe some presence for thought is ineffable. You seem to be allowing that. We could think about that later. It doesn't matter for purposes of seeing Kant as trying to eliminate that apparent possibility. It's only the appearance of a possibility.
Yeah,
that's not really addressing
the three faculties are so separate. You could say we think there are three faculties, so therefore the feeling faculty is within the realm of thought. But if what you really mean by feeling is precisely that part that's not specified in any thinking way other than for us it occurs in time, it seems as if you've got something that escapes, something significant maybe, that escapes.
Carl, are you pointing to the distinction between something not yet conceptually articulable and something in principle not conceptually articulable?
Yeah. Well,
I suspect that's what you mean.
I think that might be the way he's thinking of this, originally thinking of this, third faculty of feeling, which is very important for him. I mean, I think he does believe in the theory of the three faculties, and there's some things we can say about feeling eventually, but there could be some things that are in principle in the very system, such that we might make the strong claim. Yeah. There's no reason to think we ever could say
that. You take Hoagland to be pointing us in that
and maybe the whole thing's reminders, I just thought that being occasion, I think if we would say more on it.
It is. There's a lot of ways to think about these issues. This is a large topic, but maybe it's worth just saying, historically, in the reception of Kant's thought, maybe I think the two clearest places I can think of is in the early logical positivists when they were neo-Kantians, more explicitly clear this way. The Anglo-American tradition coming out of Royce, C.I. Lewis is a particularly clearest example. It was very common to have the word ineffability come up in expositions of Kant's philosophy. And so the idea was, sort of like in somebody like Schlick, that what is given to sensibility before it's taken up into concepts is ineffable. Schlick will talk about the blue of the sky, but then I'll put in quotation marks because we don't yet have the concept blue. And so it's like, quotes, blue of the sky, about which I can't say anything. And then, it gets this little dance of, though I apparently just have, but you need to understand that I'm not talking about the blue yet, I'm talking about the thing which is... And in fact, it's an interesting fact that this, line of neo-Kantianism, I think, is that, historically the direct target of Wittgenstein's private language argument. He's got Schlick in mind there. And in Lewis, it's not so much, first there's something ineffable, and then we bring it under concepts. It's a somewhat subtler view of everything comes as a unity, but we can abstract out what he calls the given from the pure concept. And what we've abstracted, the given, is something which we must, considering it thus in this abstraction, regard as ineffable, because it's only in its relation to it. So we can't say anything about it. To say something about it is to bring it in relation to a content. But it, the given, which we must have, which is ineffable. But I think, so I think there's a huge tradition of this. But I do think, I'll just say this in 2 sentences, that it's the very point of the reading of the second half of the B deduction, as John's explained it, to see Kant as criticizing just that reading of Kant and just that view. I mean, those are cases where the ineffability requires a robust notion of something that is given to sense, and therefore, in some sense, given to the mind is given to sense, and given to me as given to sense, while eluding unity of apperception. And therefore, as we're missing the point of the argument of the first half that Stephanie was spelling out. And so, on that reading of what Kant's doing in deduction, he is disowning just that reading. Now, that's not the only way you might bring the concept of ineffability in. I don't think that's what Carl meant. But if it's that one, then it's relevant. It's exactly what's being criticized.
Inner sense, apart from all the other apparatus, and the famous thing is he kind of brings in inner sense, and then he realizes he shouldn't allow inner sense to stand there on its own, and then connects it with other things. And I'm thinking that residue might be not the blue of the sky or something like that, but the thing that he originally talks about is the separate sphere of inner sense. I mean, it's a tremendous problem for him. I realize what his strategy is to say we shouldn't talk about that stuff and so forth. But I just think the way he's got things set up, he encourages this, and I'm not sure that he's impossible. But that's where it comes from.
Jonathan had a follow-up.
Well, just it's adjacent to this, but it's a question, John. That on page 16 you say something I find very intriguing, which is if a particular version of rationalism saddles itself with a pinched and shallow conception of reason as a mark of the distinctively human ways of living, it's not surprising that the result is a pinched and shallow conception of human life and personhood. And then you say the remedy is not to abandon rationalism, but to liberalize our conception of reason, which I think that seems to be a very pregnant thought. But the question is, what do you think that consists in? I mean, what is it for liberalism to take hold here of reason's own activity? I'm just curious what you thought. I mean, how does reason go about doing this thing you recommend? Do you have any thoughts about that?
It isn't that reason has to do something; it's that we have to.
Well, we have to
conceive reason in a different way, and that thought was supposed to get its content from the particular example that I talked about from John Hoagland. He had it as paradigmatic of the cognitivism that is one of the 2 dogmas of rationalism, according to him. To stop where Bob Brandom, on his reading, stops, thinking about the obligation to keep promises. So something like not detaching the sense of the obligation to keep promises far enough from the sanctions and etc. that might figure in working someone into having the sense of the obligation to keep promises. The unfavorable contrast between Brandom as he reads him on promise keeping, pinched and shallow conception of I don't know, the role of rationality in a case of promise keeping. Between that and Nietzsche, who I quote John's wording, the self-responsible exercise of an autonomous, protracted will. Protracted meaning conceiving itself as living life or something like that. The act of a sovereign individual with the right to make promises. So that's meant to be an example of what Hoagland describes as a contrast between acts of rationality as rationalism has to conceive them, random, and some other thing that you can get only by dumping rationalism, because rationalism is encumbered with this dogma, cognitivism. And then that all seems to me to palpably fall apart when you note that John Hoagland cites Kant as a paradigm rationalist, not only in respect of the first dogma, positivism, but also in respect of the second one, cognitivism. Because I look at that description of Nietzsche's conception of the kind of act that an act of promise-keeping is, act of a self-responsible exercise of an autonomous protracted will, and think, well, doesn't that sort of description fit Kant's conception of the moral will? So let's hang on to the thought Kant is a rationalist, but if not conceiving acts of rationality in ways that exclude that kind of thing is a mark of how we should think in dropping cognitivism that's supposed to be the second dogma of rationalism, and Kant is a rationalist. Well, then the whole thing went wrong in thinking that rationalism, Kant now as exemplary of it, is stuck with that dogma. Because exactly not. In thinking about acts of the rational will. Look at Kant's language for thinking about acts of the rational will. It lines up with Nietzsche's language for thinking about the specific act of the rational will that a case of promise-keeping is. So, I mean, it wasn't meant to be that I had some, general recipe for liberalizing. Whatever you can get out of thinking about that case. Brandom, pinched and shallow. Nietzsche, not pinched and shallow. Pinched and shallow here because it's cognitivist. That's a dogma of rationalism. So we have to escape rationalism to get to be good guys. That's the example. Well, look, Kant's already here. Hold on to the thought Kant's a rationalist. Now maybe think of Kant on the moral will as an example of a non-cognitivist but rationalist conception of a certain kind of act of rationality. Just line that up with the Nietzschean idea that Hoagland applauds. That's just giving you back everything I said, but there wasn't supposed to be anything there except a kind of summary of what I think comes out of the palpable clash between Hoagland saying rationalism as such is stuck with the dogma of cognitivism. What that comes to is exemplified in Brandom's falling short of Nietzsche picture of promise-keeping. Kant is a rationalist. That simply will not hold together. And what we learn from that is don't stick rationalism as such with the dogma of cognitivism.
But isn't Hoagland's point that what Nietzsche is talking about has nothing to do with reason?
Well, you indeed will say that if you're doing this, accusing various ways of thinking of being pinched and shallow in the interest of trying to beat up on something that you have labelled rationalism. But then,
where is the reason in Nietzsche if it's not a mistake? For him, it's just a mistake to think that what Nietzsche is talking about is subject to the claims of reason. It isn't at all, it's something cognitivism can't acknowledge. That seems to be the point.
Cognitivism can't, yes.
Even a broad and rich and subtle cognitivism can't acknowledge what Nietzsche is talking about. That's the point.
Any cognitivism can't. That's dumb cognitivism.
What Nietzsche is doing is a challenge to the whole edifice of rationality, not subtle
I think
instance of it that cognitivism doesn't capture.
It's a challenge. There's something similar going on. I mean, that it's well framed that way hinges on a tendentious conception of what the edifice of rationality is. In a way that's a kind of model for what's going on in Hoagland's treatment of
a person commits himself to keeping the promise because he can, because he wills it.
Yeah.
He doesn't do it because it's under any claim of reason. It's just
his willing it is an act of his reason.
Well, there you are.
Available to be said if you don't stick people who want to think of it as an act of reason with a cognitivistic and hence pinched and shallow conception of what an act of reason could be. And now, if you want a model of what an act of reason could be, such that the way to handle the perfectly correct critical things that Nietzsche says against conceptions of promise-keeping of the likes of Brandam's, look to what Kant says about acts of the moral will. Those for sure are acts of reason, according to Kant.
Yeah.
So Kant is a model, an exemplar of somebody who isn't buying into this idea, the idea of rationality that makes it right to describe what Nietzsche is doing as attacking the whole edifice of rationality. But let's think of.
I'm sorry. I'm abusing my role as we have several fingers. We have one, and then Jason, and then Mark, and then Jim.
I want to say something what you just said.
Oh, there's a follow up to just what I just said.
Yeah,
So I got you. Okay, right. Two right on. Oh my God. Three right on this point, and then Jason, and then you. Then you, and then Jason. Go ahead.
I think, well, you're clouding the issue. I mean, I think it's no doubt true. If we had the whole genealogy of morals before us and the reading of it, and it was a good reading, one could get a criticism of Kant out of that.
Oh, yeah.
Conception of reason. But that's not the issue here. The issue is a passage from Nietzsche, which is quoted out of context. What's going on in that passage? I think what's going on in that passage is, below the middle point of that book, is Nietzsche's sort of imagining, how do we come to get a certain kind of extraordinary animal on the scene? Let's describe this animal, on a certain understanding of what this animal can do. And I think, I bet nickels to donuts, he is trying to echo Kant in his description of that. The reason these two passages line up is not a coincidence. It's not that Nietzsche himself thinks of himself as a Kantian, but at this particular moment where he's trying to characterize a certain view that animal has of himself, he's using Kantian language. So if John just takes that passage out of Nietzsche by itself and uses it to contrast with
John Hoagland.
John Hoagland, yeah. Then we're going to get a kind of weird result, because this is a moment where Nietzsche's trying to, give a characterization of that animal that captures a certain capacity that he has, that a mere animal doesn't have, to place himself, under norms of responsibility, we might say, which, I think non-accidentally echoes Kant. And so just with respect to that one quotation, if that's,
I don't
that's
think
the
there is
thing
a quotation from Nietzsche. I'm looking.
Yes.
All the quotations on my page are from Hoagland.
But it's a passage where he talks about a sovereign individual, a creature who now has the capacity to make promises to himself. What do we call this special capacity? And then Nietzsche connects it with the word conscience, which later is going to come under criticism. But right now he's just trying to capture what it is for there to be an animal who's so describable that we can say he has a conscience. And I don't think it's an accident that, in trying to describe that, he's using Kantian language. And if John wants to single out this wonderful thing the creature can do, then it's not an accident that he's going to wind up quoting something for Nietzsche. It sounds like
Mark Lance.
Just very quickly, I basically agree with what Jim is saying. I mean, it's important to remember that this paper of John's was not a finished paper. Yeah. He's invoking Nietzsche quickly, but on several occasions, John tends to do that every now and then, talk as if these commitments are just in this sort of narrow, I do it myself and damn it. But they always, in their more sophisticated form, arise in the context of things like in the Letting Be paper, of a structure of scientific investigation in which we're subject to all sorts of rational norms, and it's our engagement with the world that rationally forces us to make these forthright kinds of commitments. So, and on a number of occasions, I've said, John, this sounds like Nietzschean in the more literal sense, and he says, "Oh God, no, I didn't mean it to sound that way." I mean, I just report. He's very consistent about that. So I think it's actually, as Hoagland interpretation, quite clear that he means to be invoking the Kantian spirit of this kind of thing, not what you're calling the genuinely Nietzschean spirit, despite the fact that he superficially quotes Nietzsche there.
Why would he do that, since he's trying to make a contrast between what reason covers and what it can't cover? Why would he do it?
He's
trying to say cognitivism misses something. It misses something in Nietzsche. Here it is.
But you're equating
He's right about cognitivism. He's wrong that cognitivism is a necessary.
He's not trying to kick reason out. He's trying to
Yeah.
kick what he sees to be a specific thing called rationalism, which he's equating with cognitivism, which is
That's right. He's equating it with cognitivism.
Nietzsche is not a cognitivist.
But he's not rejecting, the thoroughgoing influence of reason properly understood as understanding, which is embodied and embedded in all those other Hoagland things he wants to say.
Well, then the idea
he's taking rationalism to be Brandom.
Well, then the idea of criticizing Hoagland for having too narrow a view of what rationalism can do is just repeating what Hoagland wants to say. It's not a criticism.
There's something right about that. I think that this is a respect of that, and Mark is right to point out it's not a finished paper. It's a very late paper. I wish I'd talked to him about it. I don't know if he talked to anybody much about it. Had he talked to people, e.g. Mark, about it, I think maybe one of the first things that certain kinds of interlocutor would have said to him would have been, it isn't part of rationalism in a sense in which you, John Hoagland, ought to be applauding rationalism. Cognitivism is just a mistake on the part of some attempts at being rationalists. Well, I think the main kind of meat of Hoagland's paper is in the discussion of the first dogma. The second dogma, I think, is just a mistake. It should just be dumped.
Untrue
and then say, okay, now, here is what he wants to say about rationalism for purposes of attacking it, saying something like we need a post-rationalist conception of.
Well, and the cool stuff about modality, which is isn't really connect with Kant, but so obvious.
He wants to line up rationalism with what he calls positivism. So to line it up with the idea that the very idea of reality and the idea of a discursive capacity are related, and the way he thinks they have to be related is you have to understand the discursive capacity and thereby understand reality. My first point about that is it doesn't have to be directional like that. But there's something more interesting there. They're sticking rationalism as such with cognitivism looks to be just a mistake, and Mark is right in pointing out it's out of line with. No, I don't want to be lining myself up with Nietzsche in Nietzsche's anti-rationalist vein. Yeah,
Michael.
Yes, going back to Robert's question about whether there's a disagreement with Hoagland or a repetition here, and I'm wondering whether there's just two senses of rationalism. Let me see whether I'm right in what I think you're saying. When something's done self-consciously, with self-understanding of what you're doing, for you I think it's quite proper to speak this way. I'm not criticizing you. It brings it within the purview of reason. So it would first of all contrast that kind of self-conscious action with anything an animal is even capable of doing. It would also contrast it, perhaps, with what lots of human beings do lots of the time when they're just being Das Man or the morality of mores or something like that. So that's fine. But I took Hoagland to be having a slightly stronger view of rationalism, which is by no means absent in the history of philosophy, where to be within the purview of reason is not just to be, as it were, understood when you do it, but to be somehow dictated by the demands of reason in some stronger sense. And that's what links it with cognitivism. I take it Hoagland thinks that lots of self-consciously chosen action is not like that, because there are no demands of reason, as it were. So just by thinking about what's right to do, you can then, in fact, for a certain tradition, and existentialism, of course, is like this, that's in a way inauthentic. I mean, that's dropping the responsibility for what you do. Oh, reason made me do it. Don't blame me. I mean, the Logos made me do it or something. I took that to be Hoagland's target, not something as within the purview of reason by being self-conscious, but within the purview of reason as being somehow demanded by reason. And he takes a strong tradition, particularly in continental philosophy, to deny that in matters of authentic or autonomous action, there are demands of reason in that sense, and one rises above the demands of reason in a way, or one rises above habits or the merely habitual, but not by virtue of insight. I mean, so I don't know. I just thought there might be a bit of a mismatch of targets here between you and Hoagland.
I actually think that's quite a good way of getting at the point that Mark was making. I mean, the
I was
question
I was
being
passing Robert, actually.
Yeah. When you said you, did you mean Robert?
I did actually. I meant
you were looking at. Yeah. Sorry. The question.
I think there was some failure of self-consciousness here.
I couldn't.
I do have a blind eye. It's true.
Is it right on this point? Because I have two long waiting fingers.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, so in principle, it is a hand, but I think you just started. No, you just started answering it. So I mean, basically, it's a question. It's a big question about the diagnosis. So I mean, why you think? I mean, whether there is an explanation of this confusion, of this identification of rationalism with the two dogmas, and more specifically, whether there is a unified explanation. I heard you now saying that, at least with the second dogma, it seems to be a mistake. But originally I actually thought that the first dogma is a mistake. The second dogma might be just something like a reduction of rationalism to a very specific form of rationalism, say random, for example. So I was wondering whether there is a diagnosis and whether it could be unified.
And this is going to be a diagnosis of Hoagland.
Yeah.
Let me say something, autobiographical or something like that. I mean, the question that's coming up is, right, what would it be sensible to try to mean by rationalism? Should it be packed into the very idea of I don't know, rationalism is getting at a deep truth about the human condition or something like that, that we should focus on acts of reason in the hairy sense in which the existentialists point out that masses of what human beings do doesn't count as acts of reason. And I don't know that there's some out of the blue, out of no framework, right thing to say about that. But right back to autobiography. Why I care about this paper of Hoagland's is that I'm interested in a thought in the area of what he represents as the first of the two dogmas that constitute his. So I'm a thought in the area of you can't. The way to understand the very idea of the real is to put it in the right context with the idea of the discursive capacity, the capacity for thought. He thinks that putting forward something like that involves thinking that the discursive capacity must be made intelligible by itself, and then we will understand the idea of the real on the basis of that. And I begin by saying, no, let's think about. They have to be understood together. And that strikes me as a fine frame in which to put, considering, I don't know, the likes of Kant, Kant and his successors, whatever. I mean that. So it doesn't matter about what you call rationalism, but think of a basic outlook that's defined by that. And then there's a suggestion in Hoagland that beginning like that, basic outlook that's defined by that, you're already sticking yourself with rationalism in what seems to me to be palpably a narrower sense, because you've added a condition that isn't any part of that, the condition that he calls cognitivism, that opens into a conception of the very idea of acts of reason that isn't the thin one that Mike is contrasting with the thick one, right? So if it's acting as das Man, then that's not an act of reason. And you know, one can see the point of saying that, but there's also a point in saying even if how you are comporting yourself is open to criticism in that kind of way, still you know what you're doing, you know why you're doing it, and you can answer Anscombe's question why. You are self-conscious in your acting. That's what it takes for it to be an act of reason in the sense that belongs with an understanding of rationalism that defines rationalism in terms of Hoagland's first dogma, which isn't a dogma; it's a perfectly okay thing to think if you get it straight. And I don't know. The interesting diagnostic question. I don't know what. I mean, we could talk about Hoagland's upbringing, right?
That's a whole other
student. Right? Mark knows more about that kind of. But I mean, in a way, I guess what I'm suggesting is the diagnostic question isn't really. It's not as interesting as the conceptual question. How do these things really hang together? I think it's just wrong to think that proper positivism hangs together with cognitivism. I don't know why Hoagland thought that. I mean, I can reach for really superficial reasons.
Other people.
When I was, there was an occasion when I was responding to an attack on my, call it rationalism, by Bert Dreyfus, John's Doktorvater, right? And it patently made John very uncomfortable that I was saying that his Doktorvater was getting me wrong.
Yeah, no.
So that's superficial.
I actually meant philosophical diagnosis, not autobiographical.
Well,
so whether there is something
there some
in
pressure to think once you start in on espousing some form of what he calls positivism, then you're on the way towards. Right, that's an interesting question. I don't know.
I'm a little worried about people who've been on the hand queue for an hour and a half. So is your follow-up still a follow-up?
Yeah, it is related to that whole discussion about cognitivism. It goes back to your defense of the Kantian moral will. And I think with regard to this distinction between the two readings of rationalism, one being, this one description that what humans can do and what you might not do under das Man, and then the other one that is the stronger reading of the demands of reason. I think with regard to that second reading, Hoagland wouldn't let Kant off the hook here and say he fuses together the two capacities that he tries to distinguish in these two forms of promising, namely one being which Kant insists that you have to do this sort of resolute binding towards. But what are you binding yourself towards? Towards the moral law that is invariably formulated in the categorical imperative in a social norm sort of way. And that can be what this sort of like existential resoluteness gets at, because it can't be the question whether my decision to lead like a sort of resolute life can be something that everybody should accord to in the social norm, but that's clearly not what Kant has in mind if you speak of the moral will, because what you bind yourself to is the moral law, and that's invariable. So
he takes on seriously.
Yeah, and I think in that respect, Haugland would disagree with you of labeling Kant in this like more liberated way of being a rationalist, that you say, you know, we should allow. But I think Haugland would maybe not be satisfied with that as getting like really dropping into this dogma.
But where that went wrong by my lights is that you started by saying that I defended Kant on the moral will, and I'm kind of carefully not doing that in just the way in which Hoagland carefully doesn't defend. I point this out, right? He's got Nietzsche-Brandom contrast. Brandom-Nietzsche. Brandom cognitivist, therefore pinched and shallow. Nietzsche better because not pinched and shallow. And he carefully doesn't say so Nietzsche's right about promise keeping. And then he's got a bunch of other examples of conceptions which are such that you would be working with a pinched and shallow understanding of what it is to be a human being if you stuck with them. Plato's alternative to the marketplace. This is my paraphrase of Hoagland. Heidegger's alternative to Das Man. Kuhn's alternative to normal science. I mean, that's an interesting further example. So what Hoagland does is work through a bunch of contrasts of that sort, and he fairly carefully says the respect in which I'm saying the ones that aren't pinched and shallow are better than the ones that are doesn't commit me to endorsing thinking with those guys. Just so, I say, you can say right, Kant on the rational will. A conception formulable in just a kind of proto-existentialist sorts of terms that figure in Hoagland's contrasts with pinched and shallow conceptions. That can be an example of how not to be pinched and shallow without your needing to suppose that absolutely everything that Kant does with this idea, which isn't a pinched and shallow idea, is acceptable. That's left open, that's up for grabs.
But that reading you just gave there would suppose, and here my knowledge of Kant might be just insufficient, that the relationship between this willful capacity, or this capacity of will, and what it binds itself to, namely the moral law, does not have this sort of like same structure that you were, for example, pointing out in the first part of the paper between the
it's not
the unities. So that is a more substantive connection than for Kant than this sort of like just formal two sides of one thing.
Yeah, that's right. It's not meant to. I mean, part of the point is the second dogma is just completely loose from the first so-called dogma.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Jason, finally.
So this was a finger on Jonathan's original question. It was in a different direction from what we've just been talking about.
Go ahead, read mine this one.
So the counterexamples you give in the paper to cognitivism, which are supposed to point us to a liberalized conception of reason, are all on the side of practical reason. For example, you point out that cognitivism seems inconsistent with the idea that we might exercise practical rationality in actions understood as interventions, actual interventions in the world. And I see for the dialectical purposes of your paper that that's fine. I'm just curious if you see counterexamples to cognitivism on the side of theoretical reason as well, and in particular, maybe the acquisition of knowledge from perceptual experience, properly understood, would also be the counterexample to cognitivism.
Right. Good. Thank you. Yes. I mean, the very idea of cognitivism can slide around, but I do work with a characterization of it from Hoagland. Where the core idea is the idea that cognitive operations are operations on cognitive states. The paradigms of that are knowings and willings, operations of a broadly inferential kind. Right. One of the respects in which that's infelicitous on the practical side is that it's anyway hard to see how the conclusion of a practical inference can be an acting, and I arrive at that point at the end of working through the way I think Hoagland's allegation that cognitivism is a necessary ingredient in any rationalism falls apart. But I think it would be characteristic of cognitivism as he's conceiving it to react to the line that I take about the role of capacities that belong to reason in a broad sense in sensory experience as enjoyed by us. And now I'm thinking of Dreyfus. I mean, I say to understand how sensory experience as enjoyed by us can have and now I'll use it, the cognitive oomph that it does have. We should conceive sensory experience as enjoyed by us as an act of capacities that belong to, and of the spontaneity of the understanding, but in the broad sense, capacities that belong to reason. And Dreyfus looks at that and says, the abusive labels shift, but I think it's the same shape of thought. You are falling into, well, he calls it the myth of the mental, but I mean, this is intellectualism. Right, and then a debate, kind of like the debate that can break out about the. You could bring that label to bear. The way I think about perceptual experience, well, you can call it intellectualism if by that you just mean the intellect is in perceptual experiences as I conceive them. But what they mean by intellectualism is something in the area of this alleged dogma of rationalism, cognitivism. You're missing the natural animal character of concern for coping, all this kind of stuff. So the attack on what I say about perceptual experience from Dreyfus seems to be an example of the counterpart to the attack on cognitivism in the practical sphere. Pinched and shallow. Pinched and shallow because intellectualistic in a certain way, right? Leaving out leaving out that it's life. No, not leaving out that it's life. That's really crude, but yeah.
You got a follow-up, Dan?
Doesn't that help to bring out why someone would put cognitivism and discursivity together? I mean, why someone would think of rationalism as,
Well,
you were just on the diagnostic point.
It seems to me to give just another way of coming at the thought about which the diagnostic question arises. I don't know. And do you mean that they're just,
I mean, you're leaving out the
introducing a
animal
word
part. So
like intellectualism?
Dreyfus comes along and says, you're leaving out the animal part. And the sort of person who leaves out the animal part is the sort of person who thinks everything is linguistic. I mean, I'm just...
If they have a really bad view of language.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's just, I'm just, I'm not, certainly not endorsing putting them together, but just it doesn't seem as if they're simply mysteriously separate theses.
Okay.
Daniel.
Well, at the risk of changing the subject radically, I think I just need a little bit of help understanding how you conceive of the apparent possibility that's mooted at the end of the first half of the deduction, and why it's not, as you put it, let's see, a substantive thesis to show that it's merely apparent.
Yeah.
So on page 10, you give us a series of conditionals that are supposed to kind of bring out what's merely apparent about this. The first is, if we could not rule out a supposed presence to the senses that was not presence to the understanding, we would not even be entitled to the idea of presence to the senses. And I'll skip the next sentence. The second one is, if conformity to the understanding's requirements is not what licenses the very idea that sensory consciousness is directed at something other than itself, we're not entitled to suppose that those, the understanding's requirements, have anything to do with objectivity. And it's that sentence that I'm kind of puzzling over. I take it to be fairly natural to understand the understanding's requirements here as a necessary condition, such that, we can only be given objects through the deliverances of the senses. So if the understanding's requirements are going to be constitutive of objects, of objective validity, of objectivity, then in some sense they have to be constitutive of deliverances of the senses. So if they don't capture all of them, then the game is lost, right? So as a necessary condition, I think I understand it. But the talk about licensing the idea seems to suggest that the understanding's requirements are actually a sufficient account of objectivity, of objective purport. And I take it that this is somehow an idea that you want to accept, and I'm wondering how substantive a commitment you take that to be. I mean, in the deduction itself, it seems like in order to entitle us to the claim in 17, where he says, synthesizing in accordance with the categories is not just a subjective requirement that I need to cognize objects, but a condition on intuitions presenting objects to me.
Yeah.
That's linked with his ideas about what judgment is. And those doctrines of judgment and how the understanding's requirements are constitutive of what it is to make claims about objects, those are not obviously truisms to me. I mean, and I was wondering if you could first tell me whether I've got this counterfactual right, and second, help me to understand whether you think more needs to be said in order to license this kind of link between the understanding's requirements and objectivity, or whether that's supposed to be obvious.
Well, no, it's not supposed to be obvious just off the bat, but it's supposed to be made obvious by the series of sentences that you read out some of. And
especially the ones I skipped.
Well, right. I'm the one that you skipped one, right, in the sequence, I'd like to keep that in, right? Because and what I'm trying to do here is to reject a certain conception of what would be implied by the supposition that he's got to be arguing is only is not really a supposition, right? It's sort of worse than counterfactual. No coherent idea is expressed in this supposed supposition. But pretend that a coherent idea is expressed by this supposed supposition. What would be implied by it? I was anyway helped by writing and so thinking what's said in that sentence that you skipped. There's an idea, the reality that impinges on our senses. And where I want it to go is we lose that idea. If we pretend to make sense of this supposition, we lose that idea. So making play with the idea of requirements whose source is in the understanding is sufficient for, is necessary and sufficient for. It can't be sufficient. Necessary for. That'll do.
Oh,
necessary
so it's just not supposed to be sufficient.
What?
Yeah, I agree. It's necessity.
Necessary. All right. So I should have picked you up on that too. I don't know where the idea of sufficiency came from. It's necessary for us to have the very idea of a reality that impinges on our senses. If you conceive the idea of these requirements of the understanding, as selecting from among the realities that impinge on our senses, the ones that are within our powers to think, that's not a stable way to try to conceive things. Try to conceive things that way, and what you see is that the idea of realities that impinge on our senses is unavailable. If I can, press on with a sentence you did. Right, we're not entitled. I mean, if we don't have this, if we work with this filter image, we're not entitled to exclude the idea that when we count sensory manifolds that exemplify the unity required for thought as intuitings, as states or episodes in which objects are present to us, we're imposing subjective requirements on, and now this is the bit, what's really only a manifold of sensation, in which nothing is given from outside our sensibility. There's just, this not referring outside itself manifold of stuff that sensibility gives us. We're not entitled to suppose it's not like that. So we're not entitled to work with the very idea of something outside the manifold of sensation. We're not entitled to conceive the manifold insensibility in terms of ideas like objects other than it being present to us in it, or well, not to us actually, but to it. So it really does come out, if we try to think through this supposed supposition, which is collapsing on us as we think it through, that the requirements that are embodied in the requirement of categorical unity is just a requirement I put, and then we can't even say on knowing, on an object being knowable. There would have to be a sort of fraud calling it knowing if that's a setup that we're not entitled to exclude. I'm sorry, I'm just giving you back what's there in the text, but it struck me as sort of artful on your part to leave out that sentence and then be puzzled over how this can work.
I think I just had a different difficulty, which you've helped with simply by saying that it's not your view that the understanding's requirements are sufficient to secure the objective purport of representation.
Yeah.
Right? I mean that.
Well, that couldn't be right because any particular case of having an object present to your senses would have to depend on what in particular is there in the manifold of sensibility, right? So the bare idea of conformity to the understanding's requirements, right, gives you a frame in which any case of objects being present to the senses must fit. But presence to the senses, an actual case of presence to the senses, well, something's got to be. There's got to be some specificity too. The manifold of sensations.
Hegel doesn't think it's sufficient either. Necessary.
Okay.
My time is passed.
Well, no, your time is now.
It was sort of. It should have been a finger, and so.
Yeah. Okay. Mark.
I want to go back to the first dogma because, as you're characterizing it several times, you say that the dogma that Hoagland's responding to is that the structure of discursivity, or perhaps the structure of understanding, in some not specifically Kantian sense, is the same as the structure of reality. And I think you're absolutely right to point out that claim needn't involve the priority, as if we could independently understand discursivity. And I think you're absolutely right in the criticism of the specific argument Hoagland mobilizes in this paper, and a response that's tied up with the inseparability of receptivity and spontaneity. One can't have them abstracted. All right, good. But John doesn't identify positivism with that claim. He identifies it with the claim that the propositional exhausts the structure of reality. And those are the same claim, only if you think as a background assumption that the structure of discursivity is all propositional, or that the structure of understanding is all propositional. And that's something that is a substantive thesis, substantive in the sense of false in my view. But I also think it's something that John himself doesn't believe. I mean, there's many ways you could argue that the structure of understanding is essentially richer. You could think that it essentially involves interrogative structures, and that propositional structures can only have their home in relation to those. You could think that the sort of things that Rebecca and I argue, but also connecting to this second dogma in a way that isn't just diagnostic. Right? I mean, as this fellow was saying, I mean, John takes very seriously the structure of forthrightness that arises out of this worry that the norms can all be there, and I can just kind of lose interest and think, oh, so what? Maybe all of these rational norms are like the norms of football, and I'll just choose to play or not play. And at times, this is the part where I do think that he just sometimes expresses himself sloppily, because he always took it back. He goes very sort of high school existentialist and says, well, I just commit myself, damn it, all by myself. And every time you present to him things that sound like that, he would say, no, I don't mean that. Whatever he exactly means, though, it's surely right that if you take seriously that part of the structure of understanding is that moment, that can't be just another proposition. That much is surely right. And so I do think that there isn't an argument well put in the paper, but I think there's a line of thought that properly criticizes positivism in the narrower sense that the structure of the propositional is all there is.
Yeah, good, thanks. I do think that's right. The implication is that I'm being uncharitable to John, because I'm yes, sort of guilty. I'm using the ways in which his attempt to say what he really wants to say go wrong as a pretext to say a thing, mostly to say a thing about what's going on in Kant.
Well, and it's
as it were, remind him
and,
of what
he
and Jim and I
he has to take
fetched
that
up thinking. But I think you're right. You get a much stronger sense of his target if you start with the thing that I get to only after I've talked in a really general way about the very idea that the way to understand the very idea of reality is in cahoots with the very idea of discursivity. And what I pick up on his framing Kant as a adherent of a dogma, put like that, and talk about Kant. But there's a strand in the paper that I get to later that has got to look a bit surprising if you come at it from that really general conception of what positivism might be. Where what you're talking about is way closer to the surface. I mean, it isn't just discursivity; it's propositionality, and there's an amazingly restrictive conception of propositionality that he sticks what he's calling positivists with. You have propositionality only where you have something expressible by the means of a symbolic system or something like. No, but
the symbolic system.
That's a gloss on. It's a particular gloss on the idea of discursivity, which I sort of backed off from way back. I mean, in response to Carl, the relevant idea of discursivity doesn't need to be hooked up all that closely with linguistic expressibility. But then it turns out that Hogeland has a conception of discursivity for purposes of interpreting this thought, reality, discursive capacity, they come together. That really does have to do with linguistic expressibility in a really restrictive sense of what that might be. So it's got to be that the symbols do it all. Interpreted formal systems or something like that. Yeah. And now I feel like saying, well, if that's what you think it takes to be a positivist, this is a thought that very naturally goes with. I mean, it kind of falls apart when you think about it, but it very naturally goes with cognitivism in something like his sense.
But there's two moves.
Being hostile to that belongs with insisting on authenticity, because it involves it goes with insisting on connecting the very idea of expressing thoughts with something that real life, real living things do.
But that's putting together two.
I'm looking at Iran, but
two moves, though, right? There's the. I was identifying the move of saying that discursivity is exhausted by propositional form, so declaratives.
You can have that in a thinner.
And you can then there's a second move of read that thinly as symbol manipulation.
Right.
So throw that out. Right. That's just the Bert's target from the '60s. We should have just said yes. But it's still a substantive assumption to assume that the structure of the performances are all declaratival and that the contents are all propositional. And John wants to challenge that too. And that's a more interesting. And you do too.
So do you, yeah.
So do we all. So
except for Bob, who thinks that those are autonomous.
I mean,
not you, Bob. Other Brandon Bob.
Brandon. Yeah.
You're Robert.
You're Robert. Yeah.
Actually, originally it was Bobby. So.
I knew you.
Anyway, I mean, the question that then arises is, right, indeed, who's the target? And it's coming out looking right if you say the target is Bob Brandon.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of those people that Jim was talking about in the early 20th century who just presuppose. I mean, the declaratival fallacy is not unique to random. I mean, that's a bit of
the target range is very wide, and it's not an accident that target range was acquainted with the reading of Kant, because many people fell within that target range.
You get a bunch of sentences together and you're done.
But it's still worth saving Kant from
the target is bad readings of Kant.
On that ironic note, let us conclude by thanking our speaker.
whether or not they're presented as results of content, whether or not they are presented as results of content.
Surely there must be some way of appealing to somebody like you.